Epilogue Chapter 6. To join the court of cats, Tristan hummed, is most easily done. There were exactly 42 people down in the old playhouse, barring himself and Tredegar. Of these 10 were servants, which he suspected would not count as people according to many of those folk in fine black cloaks chatting beneath pavilions. The guests he'd get back to later, because it was worth picking out the strong and the weak, but Tristan could already tell the servants were a thread worth pulling at. None of them wore livery, so they weren't in the service of nobles. Neither did they wear black, so they shouldn't be watch, unless they were currently not on shift and looking to make a few silvers on the side by playing servant to students. Most brass cloaks would balk, he figured, pride offended by taking orders from wealthy children, but in a garrison of the size needed to hold Port Elysée there ought to be at least 20 willing to take that in the teeth for the money. Only it couldn't be that, because playing servant was one thing but cooking was another. That food, those drinks, they had to come from somewhere. Soldiers with a side racket wouldn't be able to deliver an evening like this even if they organized. And they wouldn't have it long to organize anyway, because why would they even try to before students arrived and the opportunity came up? Shalomance had been closed for centuries. The thief followed those neatly dressed men and women with his eyes, leaning in the shade of a tree cast in orrery light. Down below Tredegar circled around the last ring and traded greetings with guests. Tristan picked a wild rose and pulled at the petals one by one, Fortuna amusing herself by alternating hates you and loves you not. Tristan couldn't see someone leading the servants yet, but he could already tell this was no ramshackle outfit. A blonde woman behind the pavilion was counting bottles as they left the crates, keeping a tally and giving instructions about how full the cups going out should be. The 2 slender Aslan men by the food, same nose and eyes, brothers, were not only cutting and passing the pigeon pies and pastries but keeping an eye on whether or not the grilled cutlets were still warm. It was not their first time hosting a party like this. So what in the minis were trained servants without an obvious master doing on Talamanterra? "Hate you," Fortuna happily called out as he pulled the last petal. She brushed off her spotless dress, only now beginning to pay attention to her surroundings. "Your perjury's been noticed by the house," she noted. "And why are we hiding up here, anyway? You should be down there dazzling people with my wit." Tristan's gaze left a small Someshwari servant taking away the cloak one of the guests, a dark-haired woman who had no sleeves on her overcoat, turning it into some sort of doublet, but wore a wine-red undershirt with cowl sleeves that was so long it emerged past the belted as a sort of skirt. Watch fashion was only marginally more respectable than the noble kind. "So I can see who has been waiting for Tredegar to arrive," he said. He parsed through the crowd, looking for the right kind of attention. Not passing curiosity or flicked glances but, in a word, recognition. Someone down there was waiting for Angharate Tredegar, and no matter how good you were you still needed to look to know someone was there. So Tristan looked for them in turn, sifting through the guests as Angharate Tredegar began to speak with their hosts. Bored, he counted. That smirking pair? Making fun of her clothes. One was promising, no. It was Tredegar's ass and legs the man kept looking at. Sex and thus. But that Someshwari man with the contrasting brass spectacles and bulging arms who was discreetly writing into a notebook, now there was a suspect. He was looking as much at the hosts as Tredegar, but it was worth investigating. A second sweep gave him no one else, sadly, although, how long had that Melanie been eating the same prawn? The one with the belt of colored beads and the golden bangles around her arms. There were 3 large Cathayan prawns in the bronze vessel she had been handed and only one was eaten, the others forever being nibbled on at an angle that just so happened to let her study Tredegar discreetly. And after a heartbeat the Melanie flicked a look his way, surprised. He only barely ducked behind the tree in time. "Contract," Fortuna said, confirming his first thought. "And with a prickly bastard, too. He's looking for me." "Can he find you?" Tristan whispered back in alarm. "As if," she snorted. "There's so many gods in here it would be like picking a nipple out from a pile of tits." Though he had once spent 2 months working at a brothel, Tristan the Brascal had never seen a pile of tits and counted himself lucky in that regard. sounded ghastly. Yet knowing that to react would only encourage the goddess, he ignored the words beyond the useful information conveyed. "Is she still looking?" he asked. Fortuna hummed, picking at her sleeve. "No, but I think she's keeping an eye on the stairs," she replied. So the Milani was still trying to learn who had been looking at her. Spy, Tristan decided. Or at least someone with training in the craft. It might be he had found his first fellow Cryptia student. "It is a good thing I never intended to use them, then," Tristan said. The lodges didn't fill the entire ring on every tier, more along the lines of 2/3, as was only sensible, if this had truly been a playhouse once. No one wanted to watch a play from seats situated behind the actors. Tristan doubled back to the other end of the ring he was on, keeping away from torchlight and carefully avoiding ever looking in the contractor's direction, until he had reached the edge just by the stairs leading above. There he had to sneak behind the pavilion where the man with the guest book still waited, but the Learganon looked abjectly bored and half asleep. A wall had prevented passage, once, but it had long ago crumbled, and as Tristan peered over the edge he found that below was a nook of bushes and grass, but also something more, 3 wooden outhouses. There were green lanterns by them, perhaps to mark their location. The thief checked to see if anyone was around, and when not took the opportunity offered. He lowered himself atop the roof of the leftmost outhouse, then leaped down into a bush with only muffled sounds. It turned out to be thornier than anticipated, but the watch cloak and coat were mercifully thick and the cloth was hard to tear. Good quality, that, Tristan mused as he rolled out and began brushing off twigs and leaves. Tugging his collar back into place, he casually walked out and took in the layout. The party had a simple enough layout: stage, food tables, drink tables, and a surfeit of chatting princelings. Nothing arduous to navigate. The trick would be positioning himself so he could keep an eye on Tredegar and the marks in play without being too obvious about it. Tristan began eyeing the food tables speculatively, wondering if there might be time for pigeon pie or one of those. Were those cutlets beef? They certainly smelled like it. That couldn't be right, though. Sleeping God, I cannot have had that much wine. The thief's gaze was ripped away from the cutlets and onto the source of a familiar voice. Zenzalduma looked much healthier than the last time Tristan had seen him, the eye he had lost in Kentika now replaced by a false one the same color as Tupac's sickles. Nice. Milani did have a knack for being theatrically vengeful. The lordling wore the formal uniform, fitted to him and with some golden locks of rope thrown in around the shoulders. Sergeant Andres hadn't offered those, so there must be other cloth shops in the port. Another mark for the servants here not being watchmen. "Tristan," Zenzalduma said. "Is that you?" "Zenzel," the thief said, then gestured for him to get closer. Looking worried, the Milani leaned in. "I don't suppose," Tristan asked, "that you would happen to know where those grilled cutlets are from?" Zenzel began, taken aback, then paused. "No? Unfortunate," the thief muttered, then cocked an eyebrow. "Not even if you know." He gestured vaguely, implying contract without mentioning anything of the sort. "I am not sure there is anyone in all of Vesper that feels strongly enough about grilled cutlets for that to work," the lordling replied. He was, Tristan saw, fighting back a smile. Which was fair but also missing the point. Those cutlets were beef, not pork. Pigs and chickens you could raise in a ruin like Port Elysee. Practically speaking, the Merc was a ruin and both were common there, but cows needed grazing lands and those cutlets smelled fresh. The meat could be imported, of course, but how costly would that be on an island closed to trade ships? No, most likely another part of Talmantara was inhabited. Somewhere with decent land for cattle that must also be easily defensible, because there were bound to be some pretty nasty lemures on the island, and the watch wouldn't bleed their own garrison for fresh milk and meat. They could have gotten both from goats without half this trouble. If it's the watch behind this at all. Was there a colony somewhere out there, another Kentika? Hopefully with fewer slaves and devils this time. He would have to look into it. Until then, best distract Zenzel. "I thought Milani were all about cattle," Tristan said. "Isn't the name of your coinage derived from?" "The words sound similar, "But they do not have the same root," Zenzel flatly replied. "You are, evidently, attempting to distract me." Still inconveniently perceptive, then. That hadn't stopped being a pain. A pause, then the Mullaney came closer and even lowered his voice. "Were you even invited?" the nobleman asked in a whisper. Not worried or irritated, that face, but scandalously eager. The thief did not mind throwing him a bone. "The world is an invitation, Zenzel," Tristan airily replied. "Though if you'll excuse me, I need to take care of something." If he was going to be skulking the rest of the evening and leaving early, he best help himself to a meal first. Zenzel's lips were twitching as he casually waved the man goodbye, getting a nod back. Keeping to the edge of the crowd, avoiding anything more elaborate than nods and smiles, Tristan sought out with his eyes both the Someshwari wearing spectacles and the Mullaney with a bead belt. The former was by a small garden table, fumbling his attempts to fake eating a croquettes while trying to discreetly write in his little notebook. He was still watching Tredegar, but the sight of him accidentally dropping the same croquette on a page for the second time had the Sacramentan somewhat reconsidering how much of a threat he might be. That notebook better not be full of dreamy drawings of Angharad, or Tristan was going to have to break his legs, for wasting his time, if nothing else. As for the Mullaney, it took longer to find her. She was, the thief found, positioned much as he was, on the edge and looking in. He forced himself to look right past her when he found her, lest her contract be drawn his way again, and then helped himself to the nearest plated food to justify standing where he was. It was a bronze vessel with 3 peeled Cathayan prawns, each long and thick as a finger, marinated in reddish sauce. She'd chosen such a good spot to stand in earlier he had moved in the same without realizing. She was definitely suspicious. Tristan took a tentative bite of the prawn and found the taste strangely sugary. Until the spices hit, a heartbeat later, and then his mouth was aflame. Gods, it was even spicier than Old Town chorizo. It was like eating a torch only it didn't have the decency to go out. He put the prawn back and discreetly coughed into his fist. Fortuna, seeing the expression on his face, began cackling. "You look like they're making you swallow hot coals," she said. "Start moving around a little and it could pass as a fresh form of dance. 1, 2, 3, 4, to the left and, a cup of water, sir?" He'd not even noticed the man approaching with a tray of cups, distracted by both an intangible hyena and the very fires of hell he had foolishly allowed entry into his mouth. Learganon, he immediately thought, early 30s. Curly brown hair and blue eyes, fit but not muscled and the calluses of work but not killing work. The thief put on a smile, coughing again. "Please," he got out. He took the offered cup, slowly drinking. Merciful relief. "You may well have saved my life," he seriously said. "All in a day's work," the other man replied. Taking a second look now that he was no longer dying, Tristan saw what he missed on the first pass. Rings around the stranger's eyes, only half hidden by powdery cosmetics, and the edge of a tattoo under the man's left sleeve. Tristan could not make out the whole of it but could hazard a guess from what he saw. Green ink, a rearing horse and a rider holding what should be a sword, old Saraya's arms, which was a common tattoo on their sailors. The man did not look like a sailor, but it might just be common practice in that region and the thief had simply only ever met Sarayan that were sailors. Either way, the conversation was as good a hook to get into it with one of the servants as he was likely to get. Sympathy, he decided, would serve best as the opening line. "You look like someone whose shift has been going on for 6 hours too long," Tristan noted. The man snorted. "Try 10, he said, then cocked an eyebrow. "Sacramonte?" Tristan knew that accent, the way it softened Z into S, and it confirmed the tattoo's hint. "Born and raised," the thief said. "If I don't miss my mark, you're Sarayan." "From the Queen of Cities herself," he proudly said. Not that anyone but the inhabitants of Old Saraya still called their capital that. When the Grand Canal broke back in the Century of Crowns, the city built at one end of it had withered on the vine. Nowadays the Mullaney had seized the lands on the other end and sometimes made noise about clearing the waterway, but with Sacramonte willing to make war over the matter, nothing ever came of it. The six had spent centuries bullying their Sarayan rivals into irrelevance. They would not tolerate a resurgence. "You're a long way from home," Tristan said, draining the rest of the cup. The Sarayan asked for it silently and set it on the edge of his drinks tray. "Not as far as you," the man snorted. "Though I take your meaning. This is a little further out than the Islas Reales." "Ah, Sarians." Centuries since their island empire had turned to dust, and still they called the island chains closest to their shore the Royal Isles. Old Saraya was no longer even a kingdom, but to hear them talk you'd think they were the second empire come again. "It has been a strange few years," the man admitted, then offered his hand to clasp. "Arno." "Fernando," Tristan replied without batting an eye, shaking it. It was simply the first name that had come to mind, but now that it was out, it'd be foolish, but the notion was simply too sweet to resist. "Fernando Vilazar," the thief winning smiled. If Fernando came at him with that rapier of hers he would just have to trade information for mercy. "Well met," Arno replied, then rubbed the bridge of his nose with a groan. "Should I leave you to rest?" Tristan asked. Using the tired for information was always a coin toss, and he was not yet so pressed for time he must forge on here. "Please don't," the man said. "As long as I'm talking with a guest they'll not get on my case for not making the rounds." "Rough boss?" he casually asked. "She's been working us to the bone," Arno grunted. "Thinks a success tonight means all those little watch pricks are going to keep hiring us through the year." "So definitely not a watchman himself," Tristan noted. As he'd thought, the servants were not Blascloaks. And they seemed to be running their own enterprise. Did the watch allow others property rights on their island? Odd. "No offense meant," the Sarayan hurried to add. "You just don't seem like." "I was brought along by exactly such a little watch prick, don't you worry," Tristan grinned, then let the amusement bleed away and sighed. "You're not the only one working. I'm supposed to find out a pair of names, but I honestly have no idea how." A lie, but servants always knew more than they showed. If Arno could let him get answers without having his face known, Tristan would prefer that route. "Try me," Arno said. "Which two?" "Ah, a bite." Tristan's hand left the cover of his cloak, discreetly indicating the Someshwari with the wiry spectacles. "No idea," the Sarayan admitted. "The second?" He now pointed the Milani with the colored beads belt and the golden bangles. "Captain Imani Langa," Arno immediately said. 11th Brigade. "That was quick," Tristan said, not hiding his surprise. "She's captain to one of the money bags that hired us," the man explained. "She's come around once or twice and Jinjing told us to treat her like a queen." Jinjing being, Tristan guessed, their leader. The one putting the screws to her crew. Why such a thirst for coin, he wondered. It could be simple greed, but Talamantara was surely not any thinking woman's idea of a place to strike it rich. Perhaps there was some kind of bargain with the watch, a rent or a cut. "That makes one," the thief happily said. "Many thanks, Arno. It is all in the circle," the man dismissed. "Besides, Nostros y el resto," Tristan finished. "Us and the rest." Emperor Vittorico's famous answer to the Aztlan queen that he'd called him a madman for making war on her over the dead of a single handmaid. "She was Learganon," Vittorico had replied. "There is us, and there is the rest." The lowest of Leargan stood above even the kings across the water. It had been the boast of empire once, the Second Empire's destiny of conquest manifest. But after the empire's collapse, when entire provinces were swallowed by the dark and once conquered kingdoms broke away and began gobbling up territories, the meaning shifted. Us and the rest, men still said, but now it was in solidarity. The last children of Leargan, beggared inheritors of the great empire that had united Vesper, and though they were a mightily squabbling tribe they shared root and blood. Cousins over foreigners, that was what the words meant nowadays. Tristan saw the pull of that dream, of its shared inheritance, but he had been taught better. Men will do all manners of foolish things for an empire, even a dead one, Abuela had laughed. Where was that brotherly love when Sacramonte sought to rule the waves? when Soraya tried to unite the July the Douquesses burned every port that did not fly their banner. The mighty nail that dream to their banners and wave it still because they know men will cut off their own hand for it and call it patriotism. So no, Tristan had not bought into the lie. But he was not above using it, not in the slightest, or encouraging it. He slipped a pair of coppers against Arnaud's palm under the tray. He did not even pretend to refuse them before spiriting them away. "You shouldn't have," the servant half-heartedly said, as if by rote. "It's all in the circle," Tristan echoed with a shrug. Arnaud hesitated. "If you were spending someone else's coin," he said, "there might be a way to get that other name." The thief leaned in, careful not to look too eager. "Estevan out in front, the man with the guest book," the Sarayan said. "He's charged with remembering all the names and the faces. He'll hold out for silver, though. Used to be a lord's man, has ideas." Tristan did not, unfortunately, have silvers to spend. He was even running low on coppers, only 5 left. The cook had mostly paid for the sergeant's boots getting ripped and mutton jerky, but it should be worth a look regardless. He thanked Arnaud, discreetly disposed of the light-bringer's own prawns and considered how he might best go about approaching this Estevan. "This is an evening for honorable company, Zenzel Duma," a voice called out. "By what right do you attend?" Some Milani noble was having a tantrum, which Tristan would have been entirely indifferent to if it did not involve an acquaintance. Which it did, unless there was another Zenzel in attendance. As the Milani lordling was not an ally, Tristan would have been only marginally concerned by the situation, but of course it could not be that easy. Standing by Zenzel and Ferranda, so she had made it after all, good on her, was Enjolras Tredegar. His fellow cabalist looked faintly disapproving, which on her was a look that could mean anything from someone speaking out of turn to an imminent duel to the death. Fuck, should he get involved? No, that was looking at it wrong. Tredegar wasn't out of her depth here, she was in her exact depths. What had she been trained for, if not honor games and ritualized stabbing? He didn't even have to worry about her going too far if she got into a fight. The Perdiri would keep to the precise letter of her word. She was a shark in her native waters, right now, while he'd be a rat on a plank while trying to instruct her on how to swim. This was not a problem, it was an opportunity. Zenzel and the whiny noble got into it publicly, which drew everyone's eye. The guests settled in for the show, a few of them moving to the first ring so they could look down at this as if it were a play put on for them, and that was a fine cover for heading up. Tristan went up with a pair excitedly chatting, slipped into the garden and doubled back towards the small pavilion where Estevan would be waiting with a guest book. Only it turned out he was not the only one that notion had occurred to. A tall Tianxi was speaking in irritated tones to the greeter, an interesting enough sight. Tristan crept close and slipped into a bush to be able to listen in. 3 arboles? The Tianxi was saying. That is absurd. I am asking for a name, not the key to your sister's bedroom. I was willing to be bargained down to 2, Estevan coldly replied, but for that comment it will be full price. Pay or leave, I will debate no further. The Tianxi, who was tall and broad-shouldered but not all that muscled, not a fighter, perhaps, looked furious and tried to argue, but the servant was unmoved. Cursing all the while, the Tianxi paid and Tristan leaned in curiously to hear what had been worth that price. Her guest is called Tristan a Brascal, Estevan said. Gray eyes, dark brown hair, around 5'9". Skinny but not sickly. Wearing the fighting fit, he has on him a knife and something else strapped to his leg. The thief went still in the bushes, watching a glint of triumph come to the Tianxi's eyes. It had been for him the other man was looking. Well, it seemed like he had found the first brigade out to abduct him. More worryingly, it also looked like they had just found him. The thief stayed in the bushes until the Tianxi was gone, the servant sneering at his back and muttering something no doubt unkind, as he considered his options. Tristan's neck was on the menu now, but that had always been going to happen. It was simply unpleasant timing. In the distance, down below, there was shouting and something that sounded like Tredegar's voice. Ah, she was definitely going to cripple the sneering Milani then. Tristan was going to have to learn his name and brigade in case this came back to haunt them. Still, as Tredegar was being so enterprising about stepping into danger, he should honor the spirit of their company and do the same. Rolling out of the bushes under the greeter's bewildered gaze, Tristan rose to his feet and brushed leaves of his cloak as he offered the man a hard smile. "Good evening, Estevan," he said. "I have some questions for you." The neatly dressed man froze for a second when he realized he had just been caught selling information about someone by that very same individual. His face immediately closed down, and he straightened his back. "Master Abrascal," he said. "What can I help you with?" "Oh, Estevan, all sorts of things," Tristan happily said. "And you'll do it, too, or I'll be working straight to the nearest watch officer to tell them you're a participant in the attempted abduction of a Blastcloak." His face did not so much as twitch, but his eyes dilated. "Doubtful," he said, sounding confident. "The man I did business with is Watch," Tristan said. "He'll get a reprimand, and that's it. But he's wearing black, my friend. I cannot help but notice you're not. How do you think that will go for you?" To his honor, the other man showed no hint of fear in the face of what was a very real threat. But he was afraid, Tristan decided, and his next words betrayed as much. "What do you want, Abrascal?" He bit out. "Two names," he said, "and the matching brigades." Estevan said nothing, but irritatedly gestured as if to tell Tristan to get on with it. "The Tianxi who asked you about me," the thief said. "Captain Tang Feipan, 49th Brigade," Estevan flatly said. The thief filed that away. 49th, was it? He must be a latecomer. "A Someshwari with brass wire spectacles and big arms," Tristan said. Estevan did not answer, only watching him expectantly. "I'm waiting," the thief reminded him. "And you will keep waiting," Estevan said, "until you pay me 2 arboles. A name for a name, Abrascal. Anything more costs you." Tristan hummed. He could have repeated the threat, but there was a chance the man would call him on it, and in truth he did not have to want to leave here just to follow through. Fortunately, Estevan had given him a second lever without realizing it. "I'm a generous man, my friend," the thief smiled. "I will even pay you 3. Rightfully wary, Estevan frowned. "Pay up front," he demanded. "I already have," Tristan said. "I am giving you 3 arboles by not informing Jinjing that you are taking bribes on the side. Somehow I'm guessing you're not cutting her in on those, are you?" By the sour look on Estevan's face, he was not. The man spat to the side, into the same bush Tristan had rolled out of. Fair. He was getting robbed out of a decent bribe. "A dosh hapar," the greeter said. "He's not in a brigade yet." "Come now," Tristan said. "Such a thin report for 3 arboles? That would be most unfair of you, Estevan." Estevan looked like he wanted to punch him in the throat, but the thief only smiled. He had little care for the anger of a man who had sold him out and then tried to shake him down. "He's Varavdan," the greeter bit out. "Unarmed. And he's a guest, not invited. Came in with Lady Cressida of the 19th. The 19th Brigade, was it? Another potential foe to investigate." Tristan was almost beginning to sympathize with Song. They were accumulating enemies at an impressive rate. The fact that this Adarsh was Varavdan was worth noting, but ultimately of no use to him. Varveda was one of the most powerful realms within the Imperial Someshwar, but it was also landlocked. Tristan had never met any and knew little of their ways. The thief could have pushed Estevan further for details on this Cressida, but it would not be worth the time and trouble. Best end this now and return to more important matters, so Tristan found the other man's eyes and smiled. "Our accounts are settled," he said. "Let us part ways here." The man glowered angrily. "You think I'll forget this, Abrascal?" "Try to," Tristan honestly advised. It would inconvenience me," he said, "to have to spend an afternoon on killing you without leaving a trail. But you must understand, Estevan, that is all it would be to me." He stepped closer, into the dark-haired man's face, and the servant stepped back. "An inconvenience," Tristan softly said. He smiled again and the man flinched. "Do we understand each other, my friend?" Estevan swallowed, all the more loudly for the silence between them. There was laughter in the distance, something amusing the crowd, but the thief did not look away. The other man nodded, hands shaking. "A good evening to you, then," Tristan said, and left him. He had a duel to watch, though he suspected it might not last all that long. A butter knife. Tristan was not sure he would have been able to cut cold butter with one of these, much less a Milani swordmaster. Even one with only 3 stripes to Angharad's 10. Mind you, the thief would not have bet on himself against a fledgling Milani swordmaster with 3 limbs if it came to a sword fight. Given how excited the guests became after the humiliating victory and this Lord Musa change, 9th Brigade, that one, which he gathered was going to be a problem since their captain was a well-connected prick with a reputation for being vindictive, it was not all that hard to get a few of them talking. The difficulty was to do it without getting seen by the captain of the 49th, who was roaming about and having cart conversations with others while his eyes wandered, all the while Tristan himself kept an eye on this attaché bar. The trick was to let himself be seen above in the gardens or near one of the nooks, then go around and while the Tianxi furiously searched take the time to help himself to a plate and some conversation. No great secrets were revealed, though as he tore through a few cutlets, delicious, he was surprised to see the number of people who were glad for Lady Ferranda. Or rather Captain Ferranda Velazar, she was now called, of the 31st Brigade. Ferranda was friendly with many other cables by dint of having suggested that every 2 weeks a sort of conclave should be held between captains willing to share information on the perils of Portalazé. It was only sparsely attended, Tristan read between the lines, and he doubted any secrets of worth were being traded. But it had allowed a few of those in attendance to avoid wandering into dangerous parts of the city by accident, and for that she had won gratitude. Lemures and lars were apparently quite common if you ventured far enough from the inhabited part of the city, Tristan learned, save on a road to Cholomance that the watch kept clear by regular patrols. The thief kept using the name of Ferrando, knowing that Captain Tang Fei would be looking for him under another, though he refrained from using the false surname. Too likely to get him caught, however amusing it might be for a while. That effort and staying out of sight paid off, Captain Tang Fei eventually losing patience and wandering up into the ring gardens without his first arranging a sighting. After some minutes passed the man did not come back, which was no sure thing but allowed Tristan time for further boldness. Time to move on Adarsh, then, before he too decided to leave. The Varavdan kept scribbling in his notebook by the garden table, eyes still on Angharad and her fresh escorts. Ferranda and Zenzel had evidently decided they were in her debt for the earlier public execution of Musa Change's reputation. A butter knife, gods. He wouldn't have believed it if not for his own eyes. If he ever had to kill her he'd need a better plan than poison, that hadn't worked out too well for Bronanir Etzi. Tristan also needed Adasha's notebook, so a distraction was in order. He cast a look around to find something of use, and to his mixed feeling it appeared as if Lucifer's fiery vengeance might be. He took aside one of the servants wandering about and told him that Adarsh, who was discreetly pointed at, had been asking if there were any Cathayan prawns left. There were not on the table, but the woman assured him that there were some in the back. Given the professionalism of the servants, within a minute a bronze vessel with the prawns was offered to the Varavdan, who looked surprised and asked a question, but when the servant looked around for Tristan she found the thief was gone. Hiding, in fact, behind a conversing pair a few feet away from them while feigning to be drunk and getting his bearings. Readying himself for the opening, Tristan watched Adarsh bite into a prawn and not be set aflame. Someshwari, right, fuck, the thief thought. They sold half the spices going around the Trebian Sea, the other half proverbially being crammed into everything they ate. Only the man's eyes widened with delight instead, and he positively devoured the prawns before calling for the same servant to come back. Having been exposed to fortune from a young age, Tristan was highly skilled at pretending utter coincidence had been a grand plan, and he promptly stepped into the opening. While Adash addressed the servant, facing that way, Tristan discreetly passed behind him with his face angled so the servant would not be able to see it. He swiped the booklet from the table and promptly disappeared into the crowd. He ducked out into the garden above, cracking open the pages once he was out of sight, and frowned down at what he saw. Only 3 pages were in use, each titled with a name. Ferrando Velazar on the first and third, Angharad Tredegar on the second. Beneath them were a mix of names, numbers and words in Samratrava that he could not decipher. The numbers, though, were imperial. And they were telling, none above 50, several repeating. Brigade numbers. The man was keeping track of who talked with Angharad and Ferranda, though he did not seem to have everyone's names or brigades. Perhaps to fill in the blanks he might be using physical descriptions in his native tongue, explaining the Samratrava. Either way, this was concerning. Adashhabar had clearly been sent to keep an eye on those two, and despite the utter lack of subtlety he had gathered quite a bit of information. From up in the ring garden Tristan had a clear view of the Varavdan, realizing his notebook was missing, but instead of anger or throwing a tantrum he was surprised to see Adash pale. The man looked around for it feverishly, and when he found nothing turned to the garden ring at a fast pace. He was not searching for a culprit, Tristan realized, but preparing to leave. That complicated things. Hiding so Adarsh went past him, Tristan ripped a page from the notebook and found Arnaud again. He asked to borrow charcoal to write a note for Angharad, keeping it brief. Imani had eye on you since you talked with Hos. Careful. Ferranda is liked, good ally. Avoid 49th, enemies. Am following lead, don't know when back. And forked out another pair of coppers to make sure Arnaud delivered it to Angharad unseen. The man was more than willing. Thanking him, Tristan hurried after the retreating Varavdan spy as quickly as he could without drawing attention. He kept his distance as Adarsh went all the way up to the rings, where he pulled up the hood on his cloak and walked into the night. Well now. Time to have a pleasant conversation with his new friend. Epilogue Chapter 7. Adashhabar was quick on his feet and not half so careless as he looked. He also was not heading back to Hostel Street, if the way he headed straight for the broken shrines behind the old playhouse was to be believed. Tristan had to wait and let him get ahead, as the stairs back down to the street were open ground with little room to hide, but he hurried after the Varavdan the moment line of sight was broken. The shrines were more rubble than ruin, but there were enough spans of columns and roofs left he could move from cover to cover. Adarsh, constantly looking back to see if he was being followed, but never in the right places, always in the open instead of the corners, entered a row of collapsed houses in all haste. A blunder. Buildings were only good at shaking off pursuers when you knew all the ways in and out. A row of ruins with more wind than walls would not help him in the slightest. Tristan cut in through a collapsed wall to catch up, then kept close as they ghosted through the ruin together. Close enough that when silver or airy light swept ahead he could see the nerves on the bespectacled man's face, those thick brows knotted into a constant half-flinch. Did he know he was being followed? Tristan did not think he had been seen, but a contract might not care for that. This island was not going to be kind to him, he could already tell. Anyone here could have a contract, it made situations difficult to gauge properly. Adarsh seemed to have some notion of where he was heading, leaving the ruined houses for the narrow alley leading up to a town square. A better choice than the houses, as the alley was so narrow it'd be near impossible to hide in. Which the Varavdan must have been counting on, as he stopped after reaching halfway in to wait and see if anyone followed. Tristan immediately gave up that game as lost, instead circling around through a larger street to the left that was full of broken statues and quickening his step on the way to the town square. The place was not so large as it had seemed, for at its heart what must have once been a few trees around a large pillar was now a thick copse touched by rubble. The trees were a decent place to place his ambush, Tristan decided, and he found a tall root overlooking the easiest path west. Hiding there, he waited and was eventually confronted with the sight of absolutely nothing. Adarsh was not coming. Had the man played him, baited him into circling around before running back towards the old playhouse? If so, the thief was reluctantly impressed. He moved towards the head of that narrow alley, risking a glancing, and found a silhouette in there, thankfully looking the other way. Ah, Adarsh wasn't gone. He was still trying to catch out his pursuer. If there was a contract at work here, it must not be a precise one. Taking this for the opportunity it was, Tristan moved the site of his ambush to a once shop at the left side of the alley head. There was a large window there, and by the looks of the marks in the stone beneath it there must have been a wooden counter wedged in. Long gone, that, but the window would serve to keep an eye on Adash's movement and the shop door should lead Tristan straight behind him. The thief settled into wait, but did not need to. Mere heartbeats later he heard hurried steps in the alley. The Varavdan did not come out, though. Instead he stopped on the left edge of the shop window, less than 2 feet from where Tristan was waiting. The thief had an almost direct look at Adash and went still as stone so movement would not draw his eye. The tanned man sagged against the wall, relief playing on his face. He took off his spectacles and pulled up the hem of his cloak, cleaning them with the cloth. Which was when Tristan reached through the window, snatching his collar and dragging him in through up to the shoulders. Before Adash could so much as scream he had a knife against his throat. "This doesn't have to get ugly," Tristan said, tightening his grip. "You just need to answer my questions." He forced the Varavdan to bend at a bad angle the way Abuela had taught him. Adash had less than an inch on him. It was easy. Not so much of a bend it would hurt but enough it'd be hard for the other man to get enough of a footing to fight him off. The Varavdan swallowed loudly. "Bhasdike," the man cursed. "I don't know who you are, but this is amiss. Your name is Adash Hapar," Tristan cut in. "You have been taking notes about who speaks with fear and of Elazar and Angharad Trediger." "Why?" The man slumped, as if the fight had just gotten beaten out of him. "Bait," he said, and for a moment the thief tensed before relaxing at what followed. "Just call me Bait, that's my name now." The bitterness in his voice was the detail that let Tristan put it all together at last. The man being a terrible spy, the individuals he had been writing about and now the mocking name forced on him? "You're with Tupac-Sickle," the thief accused. "4th Brigade." "With is a strong word," Bait replied. "Can I put my glasses on?" "I don't want to drop them, they are very expensive." "No," Tristan refused. "It would make it harder to blind you." The man shivered. "I told him no, you know," the Someshwari whined. "I'm a savant, we don't reconnoiter. That's for masks and militants." "And then he punched you," Tristan said, trying hard not to be amused. A valiant effort, but the cause was doomed. "He doesn't do it himself anymore," Bait mournfully said. "It's expendable now, she's next in the ladder." "Ask about the names," Fortuna demanded, suddenly wedged against him and leaning past the windowsill to peer at their prisoner. "Tristan, don't you dare not ask about the names." There were more important questions, the thief knew. "Truly." "Still. Explain the names," he ordered. "Sickle says it's to keep us motivated," Bait sighed. "We fight every month and the one who does best gets to use their real name while the rest of us get one of the placeholders." Bait, Trista learned when prodding further, had placed second behind a navigator called Alejandra. He stood above the inauspiciously named Expendable, who herself ranked above the even more unfortunate Acceptable Losses. Apparently Tupac had struck some kind of bargain with Lady Cressida from the 19th to get Bait into the old playhouse, under instruction to pretend he was part of no brigade. Entertaining as Sickle's general inability to refrain from being terrible was when turned on others, there was something off here. This wasn't the Dominion, there should not be souls so desperate that Tupac felt like a good idea. "Why do you stick with him?" Tristan asked. "You cannot be forced to be part of a cabal." "You think I'd stick around if I had a choice?" Bait said. "It's either him or sticking with the spares." "And your lack of alternative springs from?" Bait grimaced. "My father was a colonel in the 1200 Sleepless Slayers," he said. "Only he was, caught embezzling from company funds and selling information on the side. A free company of the watch," Tristan deduced, "likely somewhere out in the Imperial Someshwar." "And that makes you pariah how?" the thief asked. "He was selling it to the Rana of Kuril so she could underbid on contracts," Bait said. "The company didn't look kindly on that, they hung and quartered him, then tossed my family out. I was already on my way to Sholomance when it happened so I thought they'd decided to spare me, but no. They sent word ahead to Talamanterra, There's not a student here with family in the black that doesn't know what my father did." Tristan almost winced. The Watch was as a tribe, tolerating quarrels within itself but fiercely punishing any conspiracy with outsiders. This had the sound of a thoroughly poisoned well. "And a man who calls you bait is better than trying to spare Cabal." "Well," Bait slowly said, "he is a stripe." "I am aware of that particular miscarriage of a decision," Tristan said, "but why would it matter to you?" "Academians can get perks for their Cabal as part of their covenant class," the bespectacled man said. "Enough to get a real edge. I was warned that by the time the yearly test comes either you're under a stripe or you're fodder." "Perks for the Cabal, was it?" That sounded like someone running a game to Tristan. No doubt there'd be prices for the boons, drawbacks. It felt like a way for those officer candidates to tame their Cabal, get the wild beasts used to looking up to the hand feeding them. Why the Stripes would want this was easy enough to figure out, but why had the other cables agreed? "Useful information," Tristan noted. "My thanks. And what do those help me?" "You took my notes, so I'm about to be the new expendable," Bait sighed. "Captain Tupac is not forgiving of failure." The thief smiled, not that the other man could see it. "Why, Bait, there is no need for such glumness," Tristan said. "I can tell we are kindred souls, you and I." A pause. "Yes," Bait tried, though it sounded like a question. "Naturally I will return your notes to you," the thief said. "We are friends, aren't we? I like to help my friends." Bait twisted around to glance at him as much as he could, which was not very much. "Could you," he hopefully said, "take your knife off my throat then, friend?" "No," Tristan said. He paused. "Bait, in the spirit of our long and sincere friendship I would ask of you the tiniest of favors." "Oh no," the man groaned. "That page where you noted who Angharad Tredegar was speaking with," Tristan said. "You will carefully remove it and replace it with a list that makes no mention of Captain Imani Langa." The Varavdan frowned. "Why?" "Because she was the most dangerous of them by far and he wanted Tupac Sickle nowhere near someone who was a genuine threat to the 13th. "We're really not that sort of friends, Bait," the thief chided, tapping the flat of his knife against the hollow of the man's throat. "Try again." "Good as done," Bait croaked out. "That's lovely to hear," Tristan beamed. "I don't think there's any need for either of us to mention this conversation to Tupac, is there?" "Never," the Varavdan fervently said. "Your friendship is a great comfort in these trying times, Bait," the thief said. "So much that I think in the coming days I might seek you out again so we can have comforting conversations." "Please do not make me a spy," Bait desperately asked. "I am very bad at it." Tristan sighed, as if that had actually been his intention. Like Tupac would not sniff out the man before the hour was done, by the nervous sweat alone, if nothing else. Bait almost looked like he'd been in the rain. "All right," he said. "But I might have some academic questions to ask a savant, on occasion. I trust you can help me with that, at least." "It'd be my pleasure," Bait hastened to reply. Tristan strongly suspected that assertion would not survive being asked what a heresiarch was. Still, now that he had liberally used the stick he should offer up some honey. "When we have these little talks," Tristan said, "it would naturally be my role as your friend to share things with you. Rumors, secrets, perhaps I might even get information for you, if you are tasked with obtaining it by Tupac." "That could be helpful," Bait admitted, sounding pleased. "It will be," the thief replied. "That was how you kept people on the hook, by giving them things they wanted." It was even odds whether Tupac would sniff out this arrangement or not, but even if he did there could be a use for that. "I am about to let you go, Bait," Tristan announced. "But before I do, I'm afraid there's one last spot of bad news. I'm going to need your cloak." The man blinked in confusion. "Why?" "It is a hood," the thief informed him, "and you're about the right height." With Bait cut loose and a new cloak stashed away, Tristan decided to call it a night. It would not do to linger too much out here. He had yet to see Lemurs or even Lars, but it was only a matter of time. It was simple to cut straight south in the direction of Hostel Street and double back to the old playhouse, so Tristan took to the streets under the grandeury strange lights. The earlier silver had turned pale, almost like a lantern's glow, but from the way the shadows were moving between walls the false star above must be heading east. No other slice of light seemed close, so the thief expected a span of dark sometime on the way back. That prospect kept him on his toes, enough that he noticed it. The first time he saw movement on the rooftops could have been happenstance, but not the second. Tristan was all for exploring this maze-like ruin of a city and would hardly begrudge a soul standing atop a collapsed dome for better view of the surroundings, but when someone flicked a glance down into an alley to see if you were there and then precipitously hid when you noticed, things got a mite suspicious. "Someone's in trouble," Fortuna sang. "Check the roof," he murmured, pressing himself against the wall. The thief had taken the most direct path back to Hostel Street, passed along Dry Canal and now through a knot of narrow alleys reminding him of the Merc, but it seemed that had been a mistake. It had been predictable, and predictable was always the worst pick when there were people out to grab you. He should have remembered that. Fortuna's head popped out through the wall an inch away from his face, grinning. Ugh. He would never get used to that. They jumped down, but I heard people talking in the street on the other side, she told him. At least 3. Best to assume the worst and assume an entire cabal of 7 were after him, then. It could be more than one brigade out there, admittedly, but Tristan was inclined to believe that given their advantage and odds they'd not be inclined to split the bounty on his head with another cabal. The gray-eyed man breathed out, brushed away the early stirrings of fear. If he was to be hunted, best it be among alleys. He knew his way around that kind of battlefield. "Oh, I just realized," Fortuna chortled. "Maze of streets. Rat." "You're like a, don't you dare," Tristan hissed. "Rat in a maze." She proudly finished. He would have to ask Bate about the feasibility of trading in your god for another. Freshly irate, the thief got to work. First he best get off the street, lest he be herded into dead ends by superior numbers. He would have risked it against coterie thugs, but would not against Choloman's students. A glance to the side revealed there was a round window in the wall he'd been pressing against, which Fortuna had pointedly not used, and he climbed onto it. A half-collapsed arch curved over the alley, just out of his reach, but he got around that by anchoring his foot on a slightly jutting gemstone and throwing himself at the arch. His fingers scrabbled against the rough, worn bricks, but with a grunt he dragged himself atop the arch. From there it was only a small climb to the flat roof from which he had just been spied on, now deserted save for the weeds growing on it. Thank the gods he had not worn the formal uniform with those shiny, slippery boots. He'd be on the ground groaning right now if he had. Tristan crept towards the opposite end of the roof, where Fortuna had said she heard voices, but when he risked a glance over the edge the alley was empty, not so the street just past the corner, where he caught sight of someone moving. Eyeing the roof on the other side of the alley, another of those flat brick surfaces cracked open by weeds, the thief decided to risk a leap. Given how cramped the alley was, the risk came not from the leap itself but the landing, stone or not. There was no telling how solid that roof was. Cloak trailing behind him, he landed atop the brick with a merciful lack of immediate collapse beneath his weight. Wasting no time he crept for the edge, now at a better angle to look at the people past the corner. There were 3 of them, he counted. One was the tall Tianxi from earlier, Captain Tang Fei of the 49th Brigade. So that was where he'd gone to after stalking off. With Tang Fei were 2 more, another Tianxi with a chumpy face, shuffling nervously on his feet, and blondly Organon girl with a scar across the nose and a hard look about her. They were whispering, but loudly enough Tristan could mostly make out the words. "Don't see him," the woman was saying. "Too many alleys to hide around here, we should have waited in the mangles." He would have fled right back to here, Captain Tang Fei grunted back. "We have him surrounded, Ramona. Muckin will sweep from behind and 4, Tristan counted. 4 of them confirmed. Tempted as he was to simply keep fleeing by rooftop, he first wanted to know if they had a way to track him. These mangles, the name for the large field of broken, overgrown shrines between here and the old playhouse, he figured, sounded like a bad place for them to catch him. The captain and the Learganon girl both had muskets and blades, the nervous one a pistol. Any of those could end him in an instant if they found him out in the open. A flicker of movement stirred him out of his study. Not down there but closer to home. Another rooftop, flanking the one he had first climbed from the other side. Some was climbing over the edge, black-cloaked. Keeping calm, Tristan looked for cover. The edge of the roof was too low to hide him fully, but to his right a pack of weeds had grown tall enough he was able to flatten himself behind them. Unless the orrery light swept straight across him, he should be hard to make out. He could not see much himself, in that position, but there was a way around that. "That's the same one that jumped down earlier," Fortuna said. "She's looking down into the same alley but from the other side." Tristan subtly nodded. A curse in Amoa sounded in the distance. "He's gone," a woman called out. "He can't be, we fenced him in," Captain Tang Fei called back. "He's just holed up in a house." "Huang, confirm it." By the provenance of the voice, it ought to be the nervous Tiangxi boy who answered. "I don't have much left for the night," Huang said. "Are you sure you do it?" Tang Fei snarled. A sigh, then a moment of silence. "Not north," Huang said, then waited another heartbeat. "Not west. Only 4 uses now." A contract that confirmed whether someone, something, was in the direction or not, Tristan guessed. Or something along those lines. If he could get them to spend these last uses, waiting them out became an entirely viable way to get rid of them. They could no more afford to spend the night out here than he could. "I'll sweep the houses with Muckin," Ramona said. "You two take the sides to prevent him slipping away." "I give the orders here, Ramona," Captain Tang Fei flatly replied. "We might both be stripes, but only one commands." "Careful, Tang," she warned. "You got us the bounty and that got you the seat. It doesn't mean you have to stay in it." If this was what the competition was like, Tristan was beginning to feel rather more confident in the 13th Brigade, horrible number aside. He waited until he heard movement, the 49th beginning the search, and then turned a questioning look at Fortuna. "She's still on the roof," the lady of long odds confirmed. "Back to you, though, she's looking at the other alleys." "No time to waste, then." Tristan rose smoothly from the cover of the weeds, 1 step to the side and then 2 step backs. The woman who'd cursed, Mulaney, he could see from the dark skin even in this gloom, had her back turned to him. She was studying the street he'd used to get to the alley she first found him in, looking intently at a collapsed house full of bushes. Tristan leaped across the alley to the next roof, muffling his steps the way Abuela had taught him, and as he advanced to the next slowly took out his blackjack. 8 long, quiet strides as he angled himself right, and then the thief leaped again, onto the roof where his enemy was. A heartbeat after making it across he waited, looking for a reaction, but she had not heard a thing. Instead the woman crouched down at the edge of the roof, squinting at a bush being made to move by the faint breeze. Tristan took his time approaching, careful not to make a sound, and then he struck. The blackjack took her in the right temple, knocking her unconscious with a faint thump, and Tristan slid an arm around her waist to prevent her toppling over the edge. It was harder than he had thought. Her cloak hid that she was plump of body, but he laid her down on the roof, smoothing his breath as he waited for a shout from the streets below. None came. He had not been noticed. Good, he could afford to search her then. Rifling through her affairs got him 7 silver bowls, a good knife, a loaded pistol of watch make with ammunition for 5 shots, and a set of matches whose use he only understood after discovering that there was something in the inner pocket of her cloak. A round, cast iron grenade. Could be useful, he decided, pocketing it along the rest save for the knife. That one he put to work, putting his blackjack away and turning the stranger on her back, carefully ensuring she could still breathe, and pulling back the cloak to expose her legs. He took off her right boot, revealing a worn yellow stocking he took off as well. Tristan leaned in, taking her knife and sharply slicing across the back of her heel. Quick and deep, so he would fully cut through the tendon. She stirred, feeling the pain even when unconscious, but it was not enough to wake her. It was enough to ensure she would never walk with that leg again. However, the tendon was not healed. It was tempting to simply kill her so she would not trouble him again, but the risks were too high for the gain. Dropping her knife on her back, Tristan palmed her pistol and crept away. Putting a bullet in the back of the man with the contract should be enough to ensure he was able to flee, he thought, though he'd have to wait for an opening. Best to leave this particular rooftop first, he had already lingered here too long. A stripe of golden oily light swept across the nest of valleys, cast by some distant star, and Tristan ducked down as he swallowed a curse. He'd be a lot easier to see so long as the light stayed. He might even already have. Half a man's body was already over the edge of the rooftop, and the thief would never have known if he'd not looked because not a sound had been made. He met Dark Eyes, the lithe Tianxi, not one of the earlier two. This one must be Mucken, holding a naked straight blade between his teeth to keep his hands free. Tristan, naturally, shot him. He'd aimed for the right shoulder, barrel snapping back as the powder caught, but the shot dragged to the left center of mass, right in the chest, and the thief was already hoping it wouldn't be outright lethal when there was a blur. A milk-white hand with a lotus on the palm formed in front of the Tianxi, turning into a shower of tinkling porcelain shards but catching the bullet. A heartbeat later the man was on the roof, sword in hand, and Tristan grimaced. If that wasn't a Skiritai student he'd eat his hat. Time to run, tracking contract or not. The likely Mucken flicked a glance down at his unconscious comrade and frowned. I will have to cripple you for that, he calmly said. Tristan took a step back, narrowing his shoulders and putting fear on his face. Please don't, he pleaded, throwing the pistol at the man's feet. I surrender. Shouts below, the others of the cabal catching up, and Tristan took another step back as the Tianxi swordsman thinly smiled. He angled his torso so his cloak would pull in front of him, hiding his hands. A foot for a foot, Mucken said. It need not be painful. Fuck, this was hard to do blind and he wasn't sure about the length. Would you take a bribe? Tristan boldly asked, playing for time. The Tianxi laughed. You're worth enough, we won't have to dip into brigade funds at all this year, Mucken replied. You think coppers will stay my hand? A burn on his fingers told the thief it was now or never, face twisting in pain the Tianxi mistook for fear. Maybe not, Tristan admitted. But the stolen grenade he lit under his cloak might, so he threw it at the other man's feet. Only the utterly ridiculous prick was already moving, the flat of his sword about to lob the grenade back his way, so Tristan borrowed luck. The ticking began in the back of his mind. It all happened so fast he could barely make it out. A spark flew off the end of the wick and caught the bottom, spreading the fire there, and even as Mucken began to lob the grenade it exploded. Not with powder but with noise and blinding light, like fireworks, and the Tianxi screamed in pain. Tristan released the luck, opening the eyes he'd closed and finding it was all dark. Had he been blinded? No, the pale light from above had simply stopped. Too strange a turn of luck, he thought, for that to be the whole. He'd used the draw to hurt someone, more or less, and from beneath his boots the stone began to crack. Fuck, Tristan feelingly said, and fell. Falling through the roof was hard enough on his legs, but then the floor gave as well and it all went to shit. Tristan rolled around with a groan, feeling out his limbs. He was glad to see nothing was broken, though his left leg hurt like hell and his chest was going to be a mass of bruises. A couple of loose stones had fallen with him, thankfully none so large that his sternum broke. Pushing through the pain the thief forced himself to move, unsure whether or not the Skiritai had fallen down here with him. It was dark in this presumed basement, and he could not see the firmament above. He felt a sliver of fear at the thought that the collapse might have sealed the house over his head, but it was too early to give in to panic. Reluctant as he was to burn air, he needed to see, so he reached inside his pockets and produced the matches. Striking one, he took in as much of his surroundings as he could before it guttered out. Loose stones and rubble everywhere around him, in a room no larger than a carriage, and no sign of Mucken. The good news, that. The bad ones were that above his head seemed to be a ceiling of solid stone. Which meant he had not only fallen down but to the side as well. He had not felt that, but directions were hard to make out when falling in the dark. 4 matches left. He struck another to try and examine what direction he might have come from, finding only that to his left was thickly packed rubble and to the right solid stone. 3 matches left. Cursing, Tristan began crawling around the 2 directions he had not yet explored. Ignoring the throbbing of his fresh collection of bruises, the thief tried the wall behind and found it to be solid stone, though there was metal bolted in. Torch holders by the shape, gone rusty by the feel of the metal. A dead end. With only the front left, he tried that wall and found more masonry. His stomach clenched. Was he buried alive? No, he could still try to dig his way out through the rubble. It was risking a landslide in a room so small it would be impossible for him to move out of the way. But was there even another choice? He couldn't just wait here, running out of air. Against his knees, he had not felt it because the coat and cloak were so thick. Fingers trembling, he felt his way down the masonry until he found a metal grid. Not hesitating, Tristan cracked a match. 2 left. A rusty grate, barely in its hinges, blocked access to what looked like some kind of dry sewer tunnel, covering the entrance to a low and narrow tunnel. Large enough for him to squeeze through, if barely. When the match went out, the thief evened out his breath, settled his mind. He did not have his tools on him, but the grate looked on its last legs. He wrapped his cloak around his fingers and pulled at it, grunting with effort until one of the hinges gave. He broke all those he could, and though one resisted his best efforts, he was still able to pry open the grate. Into the tunnel he went, crawling on his belly as he felt out in front of him with his fingers. There was dried filth at the bottom, so long there it felt more like dirt than anything else, and when Tristan found the first clump of weeds his excitement rose. Weeds didn't come from nowhere, the wind carried seeds. He must be close to an exit. A few seconds later he came at a crossroads, left, right, front or back the way he'd come. Reluctantly, the thief cracked another match. 1 left. Only he saw near nothing, for a faint gust of wind from ahead put out the flame before he could take in much. Tristan paused, awaiting Fortuna's laughter even as relief poured in from having gotten the answer he needed anyway, but nothing came. "Are you here?" he whispered. A long silence. "Red is the least fashionable color," he tried. Silence continued, the thickness of it clogging his throat, and Tristan forced himself to swallow. Fortuna was not here, but why? He had not pulled on the luck anywhere as strongly as he had on the Dominion. Was it something about Talamanterra, an old antediluvian device that prevented her from coming to him? "She will be back," he told himself. "I just need to get on the streets again." Ignoring the cold sweat on his back, the thief began crawling forward again. The dark ahead was so deep it was his only hand that told him of the drop. Carefully he felt out in greater detail, finding more and more emptiness, then risked peeking out his head and looking around. Above was another grate, thick squares large enough to put a hand through, and though those he made out the faintest hints of light. A way back up, he thought with relief. Now the trouble was finding out how to get there. Further feeling out let him figure that he was at the edge of a tall drop, facing an identical tunnel across that gap. The drop and the shaft going up to the grate both seemed wider than the tunnel he was in, but not so wide he would not be somewhat squeezed. He could leverage his way up there, then, if he was careful. Only if he slipped he had no real notion of how long the drop would be. It might well kill him. The rat reached for his knife. "Rat King," he murmured, praying up at the street. "Prince of scraps and scrabbling, gutters and grind, smile on me this once. They are big and I am small, so help me scurry off." Tristan pulled down his sleeve and cut at his forearm, wiping the wet blade against the edge of the drop. He felt not warmth or weight, but then he never had. That was not how the Rat King did business. Besides, he was far from Sacramonte, much too far for the god to lend a hand. It had been as much to harden himself to the risk as to seek aid. He'd done it. Tristan would admit as much to himself. Sheathing the knife, the rat got to work. He wriggled out, wedging a foot on the edge of both tunnels, and from there began the climb. His body ached, bruises throbbing, but he bit his tongue and pushed on, feet on one wall, back on the other, pushing himself up slowly but surely. Sweating and aching, he made it inch by inch until he was in arm's reach of the grate above. He reached out for it, cursing when he saw the iron grid could be pushed off, but there was a large padlock preventing it. The muscles of his back trembling, Tristan slipped a hand through the grate. The lights above were strangely dim, so he could barely make out what he was doing, but he felt out the padlock carefully. A simple key lock, roughly made. Shoddy workmanship, and the metal was something softer than iron. Copper, maybe. The opening for the key was wide, and from what little his fingers could tell, the inside of the lock was the same metal as the outside. The pressure on his knees was mounting, the trembling of his getting worse as he got tired, but Tristan forced his breath to stay even. His palms were dry, his eyes open, and he reached for his knife. Slipping his armed hand through, he angled it as best he could and slid the tip knife into the padlock's keyhole. It was large enough the blade went right in, but he couldn't just shove it in and turn. It would snap his knife, steel or not. He felt out the insides with the blade, looking for the right angle, and gently began to wiggle it. Shoddy padlocks used simple teeth, rarely more than 2 plugs, so if he got the angle just right. One click, Tristan heard. Now he must find another, but the trembling of his legs shivered up and made his hand unsteady. Holding his breath not to miss the noise, he began wiggling the blade again and, 1, 2. Tristan turned the blade. Only for his boot to slip some, turning a gentle turn into a snapping sound. He almost screamed in frustration as he felt his knife's blade break, biting his lip until it bled not to make a sound as he got his foot back in place. Putting away the remains of his blade, he reached for the padlock with his hand and, loose. Breathing in, the thief pulled at the shackle and it gave. Mayonnaise, he'd gotten it done just before the snap. Off went the padlock, then he pushed the grid aside as quietly as he could and dragged himself up onto the street. Resting on his belly, every limb aching and drenched in sweat, Tristan pressed his face against cool stone and did not even care he was smudging his cheek with dirt. He stayed there breathing in the dark for a long moment, eyes closed but ears pricked. He did not know what had happened to the 49th, but he doubted the collapse of the house had been enough to kill all of them. If Mucken had died, would he be responsible by Shalomance's rules? He was uncertain, but surely that they had been the ones to come after him would count for something. Breathing out, the thief forced himself onto his knees as his cloak fell around him in curtains. He glanced up at the lights, and that was when he realized he was in trouble. That wasn't the Grand Orrery. Or rather it was, but the false stars were nothing like the way he knew. They were without color, pale and veiled and casting only the faintest of glows onto Talamanterra. Like a lantern with a cloth atop it. Fingers clenching, Tristan looked around what he had thought to be a street, but was nothing of the sort. He was on a flat roof, surrounded by what must be 100 of the same, and from the angle of the horizon on the distance must be at least 3 stories high. The city around him was portalizé, but it did not look the same. There were no glare lanterns, only torches, and the buildings did not look as worn, or abandoned. People still lived here, and he thought he could hear the noises of a city asleep on the wind. Panic welled up, but Tristan mastered it. It could be he had gone through some kind of gloom storm after falling into the house's basement, but this might also be some sort of dream. Something not real. The rough stone of the roof felt real under his hand, but it would if this were a dream. He had to believe that. First the edge of this. Whatever this is, Tristan muttered to himself. Then we decide if it's all worth screaming about. Fortuna's silence only deepened the shadows of the night. Moving across the rooftops was not difficult. The heights of the roofs were uneven, but they were also roughly rectangles, so there was always a path to climb if he went around. Like giant stairs, they were. The orrery lights above were so dim he found it difficult to orient himself, but the lights down in the city served as the north to his compass. He must have begun near the middle, and but a few minutes into the straightforward but laborious process of moving across he was given pause. There was a cottage. Tristan had grasped the shape of what he was on, more or less. The overall layout must be that of a cube made up of stacked rectangles, small houses piled atop one another over several stories like some childish god had been at play. The fit was not perfect, with roofs of different heights and some space between the houses forming pits, but he'd thought he had this figured out. Only now, In the middle of this landscape of roofs, there was a bowl with a cottage in it. Not a small one, either, neither the cottage nor the bowl. The latter was maybe 1 story deep and large as a town square, only over the roofs a garden had been made, green grass swallowed by fields of flowers in purple and blue and red, their colors weaving in and out so skillfully he could hardly tell where one ceased and one began. A small stony garden path led to a neat cobblestone cottage, at least 2 stories high, though one side went even higher with a little turret atop. That turret bore a weather vane that Tristan was almost entirely sure was not moving according to the wind. That smacked of danger to him, but also of answers. And whether this was a dream or his being cast out of his life, answers were what he needed most. The thief lowered himself down into the garden, landing softly on the grass, and crept closer to the cottage. There were great curved windows overlooking the garden, of glass, and the transparent kind. So he went around, past the door, and eyed the cobblestone walls. The stones were smooth, but he might be able to climb up and enter through the turret. Then the door opened. Tristan ducked into a bush, but there was no one at the door and it stayed open. The faint lights from inside painted the doorstep. Fuck. Alright, so this was a Gloam witch's house and he'd been caught creeping around. Swallowing, Tristan straightened his back and got out of the bushes. Best to pretend he'd always been going to come in through the front. He got back on the stone path, reached the threshold, there was a straw mat he dutifully wiped his boots on, and entered the Devil's Den. The first thing he noticed was how richly filled the cottage was. Fine furniture and polished wood, but also cushioned chairs of filigree copper, silver mirrors and even a bookshelf casually bearing a fortune's worth of colored leather-bound books. Everywhere seemed laden with trinkets, some precious like a music box in ivory but others as common as dried flowers and a shoddy mounted owl. The lights inside were soft and warm, coming from candles set in cups, and the moment Tristan stepped inside the door closed behind him. He did not need to ask where he was supposed to go, as past the entrance was a drawing room by those tall windows he had earlier seen, and at the table there a man sat with a pot of tea. And 2 cups. The stranger was not yet looking his way, so Tristan took his time to study him, average height, dark hair and an air of softness about him. So pale he must be either a hollow or kin to Mariam's people. "Do come and sit, young man," the stranger said. "It has been too long since I had a guest." The man's voice was smooth and deep, almost musical, and Tristan's shoulders loosened the slightest bit. Not because of the voice, but because even hollows did not usually lay hands on a guest without good reason. It was an assurance of safety to be named a guest, however slight one. Silent, the Sacramontan padded over on the thick carpet until he sat on the thick padded armchair facing the other man. Finally facing him, Tristan's eyes skimmed over a long face and straight nose touched by a bump. Classic Trebian Islander looks. And he must be a hollow, else why live in a house without any glare lights? The armchair, to his discomfort, was almost sinfully comfortable. He didn't know what was inside those cushions, but it certainly wasn't straw. "You seem shy, for one of such bold wanderings," the man said. "Might I have your name?" "Tristan," the thief replied, unwilling to give more. "And I must confess I did not come here on purpose." The other man hummed. "Not your purpose, perhaps," he said. "But a purpose, most certainly." Tristan squinted at him. "Would you happen to be a priest, by any chance?" A soft, almost pleased laugh. "Once upon a time," the man agreed. "I have withdrawn from the life, though not so thoroughly as I had thought, if you can find me out so easily." He paused, smiling in a flash of pearly perfect teeth. "Call me Salkus, Tristan," he said. "Would you like a cup of tea?" The thief considered the phrasing, then leaned in. "Is the tea poisoned, Salkus?" Tristan politely asked. The dark-haired hollow laughed, not offended in the slightest. "My dear boy," he said, "you are a lucent standing but an hour's walk away from the Lightbringer's own summer palace. In what world would I need poison to dispose of you?" Tristan made himself smile, as if he had been aware he was apparently in viewing distance of the fucking king of hell. Salkus didn't sound like someone selling a line, either, but instead as if he were stating a simple and well-known truth. Most distressingly, the thief found he believed the priest. So he swallowed, nodded, and let the hollow pour dark fragrant tea into a cracked ceramic cup. Sakis encouraged him to try it and Tristan did. He'd been prepared to fake a smile, but to his surprise it was genuinely delicious. Nothing at all like the Tianxi and Someshwari leaves he knew, tasted fruity, and sweet without being sugary. "It's very good," he admitted. Sakis beamed. "Strawberries, young man, the secret is strawberries," he said. "I make my own jam from those that grow in the garden." Tristan took another sip, mirrored by the hollow across the table, then set down his cup on a saucer. "Thank you for the tea," he said. "You are most welcome," Sakis easily replied. "Though as you earlier mentioned a purpose yet unknown, I expect you have some questions for me." "I do, if you would allow it," Tristan slowly said. He had not given his entire name on purpose, and though the man did not seem like a god in man's guise, he would not ask questions if they need be traded for boons. "I do enjoy a mystery," the priest affably said. "Ask away." The thief hesitated, then bit the bullet. "Where am I?" he asked. "This is the city of Lizay," Sakis said. "Once capital to a kingdom of some import, now the seat of infernal enterprise. The Prince of Lies again." Perhaps that was the thread he must pull it to unravel the truth of where he was. "And what," Tristan asked, "would that enterprise be?" "That depends, I suppose, on whom you ask," the priest mused. "The princelings out there will tell you that the Isle of Solomon-Terra is where a great empire is to be founded. It is, after all, where we raised the monstrous palace that is to be its seat of power." Solomon-Terra, the thief noted, and not Talamanterra. Sakis did not seem the kind of man who misspoke, so it must be another name for the island. "An older one?" "You don't believe that, though," Tristan said. He was sure of it. It had been a kind manner of condescension the man spoke with, but condescension nonetheless. "That the forges of hell will spew out an endless tide of devils, sweeping over the world as the vanguard to our kind." Sakis snorted. "Hardly. It is not in the nature of the morning star to raise thrones, only to topple them." "Then what is he after?" he asked, gesturing around. "As an archbishop of the Sunless House, I suppose I should be telling you that the Lightbringer's plans matter little, for no matter in whose service ours is a holy work," the dark-haired hollow said. "In putting out the lights we will end the tyranny of bounds and release all souls from imprisonment, as is our sacred duty." Tristan went very still. He had heard of the Sunless House before, like Ganon. The 13th Betrayal, the cult that had gnawed at the insides of the Second Empire for decades, maybe even centuries, before bringing it down on the head of the last emperor. No hollow cult was as feared or despised on the Trebian Sea, not even centuries after the Watch had put down the last of them. And now he was sitting across an archbishop of their kind, one of their great warlord priests. He forced himself not to swallow, but the other man's brown eyes had a knowing glint. "You don't sound like you believe that either," Tristan said, pressing on. "I am an old man, Tristan," Sakis replied. "You don't look it." It was hard to put a number, given the smoothness of his appearance, but the thief would have guessed no more than in his 30s. "I look however I care to," the archbishop dismissed. "Mastery of one's flesh is one of the lesser mysteries. Suffice it to say that I was young when this city was young, and it is no longer that." "And what does that mean?" Tristan asked. "That I know what it looks like," Sakis said, "when someone sits by a window waiting to die. And that is what the Lightbringer does, watching as we all squabble at his feet, princes drawing kingdoms on maps of places they have never been, Origins pupils hollering for holy war, and the devils trying to make themselves into a court like a jigsaw puzzle where every piece bites." The dark-haired man shook his head. "I know not what he intends, but the Morning Star lost all interest in Solomon-Terra once the last stone of his palace was set down," the priest said. "He knows the Watch has called on the great powers and they muster a host to kill us all, yet he only waits." Sakis might well be right, Tristan thought. He did not yet know whether this was a dream or not, but if this was a glimpse of a time past, then the island really had come into the possession of the Watch. A change the thief doubted would have come by peacefully. So why stay here? Tristan asked. Take a ship, leave. It is a lucent disease, the fear of impermanence, Sakis amicably said. You draw bounds between before and after that do not exist, find loss in the indivisible. Does water fear to become snow? It might, Tristan mused, if it could think it all. Souls were forever bound to the circle perpetual, spinning and spinning until they had become unto gods, but a death was still a loss. You kept nothing of what you had been, once you returned to the circle. Stripped clean of anything that might ever have mattered to you. No, death was something to fear. But that wasn't the way Hollows thought. They didn't really see death as being death, it was why they seemed so unpredictably violent, the stakes they played with just weren't the same as other people's. So you're sitting here by your window, the thief said. Sipping a tea and waiting for the tide to catch up. So I am, Sakis easily agreed. Yet we have spoken of me quite enough, I think. What is it that brings you to these shores, Tristan? I am lost, he admitted. And very far from home. No one is ever lost, the priest laughed. There are no right or wrong paths. You are ever where you should be. I'm not even sure I am when I should be, Tristan dryly replied. Much of this seems strange to me. He had spoken the words casually but kept a careful eye on the other man's face. What would he think, how would he react? With benign amusement, was the answer, unless the priest was better at feigning emotion than Tristan was at ferreting out. Time is largely a lie, Sakis assured him. Do not worry too much of it. This was not unlike, the Sacramontan mused, being comforted by a shark. The intention was there, but the teeth were no less bloody for it. Yours is a very soothing kind of nihilism, the thief decided. And your skepticism is very amiable, Sakis complimented. It is important, the understanding that knowledge is not iron but a reed, it breathes, changes, bends. A mind of iron is ever fated to break. Tristan finished the last of his cup just as the first roll of thunder struck. Sakis unhurriedly rose to his feet, pulling open a window, and in the distant sky they saw flickering lights. Not that of the orrery but of glare lanterns against clouds. Ships, Tristan thought, come to the port. And they had announced themselves with cannons, so they came not in peace. Time to go, the thief decided. It has been interesting, Tristan honestly said, setting down his cup. But I must leave. I fear the consequences of lingering here. The priest smiled, leaning on his elbows to watch the signs of his approaching doom, as if he were enjoying the view. The tide has finally caught up, I think, Sakis said, then shook his head as if slinking out of reverie. He glanced back at Tristan. I should give you a gift to commemorate our meeting. I expect there will not be another. Tristan stilled. That's not necessary, he said. It was done long before you came here, the archbishop easily said. I lay here a mystery, you see, a line in the sand, none may find this house who have not tread its ground before. Sakis shrugged languidly. You are not lost, Tristan, he said. Home is where you make it. The thief hesitated. It was a fool's thing to ask, but the curiosity burned. What will you do? He asked, licking his lips. Sakis smiled, grandfatherly for all his apparent youth. I am the last archbishop of the Sunless House, my boy, he said. I have partaken of the eldest law and made it into my bones, sung the words that eat themselves. The air shivered, as if the world itself were flinching what had been spoken, and Tristan found he could not look away from Sakis' dark eyes. They were pits of darkness, endless and cold and unhurried the way only something beyond time could be. If the watch comes to my doorstep, I will help them remember why they should be afraid of the dark. Tristan forced himself not to run to the door, but it was a narrow thing. The garden felt sinister now, the reds deeper and the purples poisonous as he hurried down the path. There ought to be a way down from this place, Tristan thought as he found a lower edge to the hollow the cottage was tucked away in. In his haste he misjudged a stone, and when he put his weight on it to push himself up it gave in a spray of powdery mortar. With a grunt the thief fell back down into the grass, shielding his face with his hands so the stone would not smack into it. When he sat up with a groan after, though, the grass under him felt coarser. As it should be, since he was no longer in that hidden garden. Around him were ruins, gutted houses and streets akin to the Portalazze he knew. Excitement rising, Tristan looked up and finally let out a relieved breath. The orrery above was the one new, the colorful false stars. Gods, but he'd never thought he would have been pleased by that eerie sight. So what had happened? Had any of it been real, or was it all some sort of gloom delusion? Tristan rose and went patting around for his knife, finding it missing. Yet he could have lost that when he fell through the roof. Strange as it was, he was now nowhere near that place. It was only when he dug up the matches that he got a definite answer. There was only one left, like in the dream that had not been a dream at all. The thief swallowed nervously, for this sort of thing was well past his understanding. He needed to find Mariam as quickly as possible and find out how long had passed. Remembering Vanessa's watch, Tristan fished it out. An hour and change passed as leaving the old playhouse. More or less equivalent to the time that would have passed if he had never been elsewhere. How did it work? Had it no, he thought, shaking his head. To guess without a grounding in the matter was just stirring air. Mariam first, then he could panic. The thief found a collapsed house that made for an easy climb and got onto the tiled roof, finding the direction the lights of Portalazze were in, straight ahead, and from where he stood he could even see that a new ship appeared to have docked. Tall and slender, its sails lowered as dockworkers unloaded its contents by lantern light. Tristan headed straight that way, putting a spring to his step as he entered a stretch of pale light. He kept a wary eye for lemures, for he was tired enough to get sloppy, and was rather relieved when at the end of the street he found a patrol of blast cloaks. 8 of them, led by a tall Someshwari woman with lieutenant stripes on her collar. Tristan hurried their way, but about halfway through the street his steps slowed. They had seen him, but instead of a wave or a jest what he got was the watchmen spreading out in a line with their muskets raised. A second later he saw why. Between them, in the middle of the street and going across houses, was a painted red line. Something told him he wasn't the one on the right side of it. Mayonnaise, he cursed under his breath, then cleared his throat and called out. Apologies, Lieutenant, I did not cross the line on purpose. I was caught in hands where we couldn't see them, the Someshwari lieutenant harshly ordered. Now, grimacing, Tristan did his bid. How could he talk his way out of this? They did not seem overly inclined to shoot him, but neither did they seem overly disinclined. Don't make sudden movements, one of the men barked. They are the very last thing on my mind, Tristan assured him. Not so much as a flicker of amusement on anyone's face, all of them keeping the muskets pointed and unwavering. Do you have a plaque? The lieutenant asked. I do, the thief said, hoping he had found an end to the canal. 13th Brigade. My name is, take it out, the lieutenant interrupted. Slowly, with your bare hands. Bare hands. Was there something unusual about the plaque's making, then? Tristan carefully reached inside his cloak, producing the round silver seal and holding it up to their lantern light. And now? He asked. Now we wait, the lieutenant said. Soggy? Started the count, Lieutenant. The one to speak had been a tall Milani in the back, who was now looking at an open brass pocket watch. A long moment of silence passed, muskets pointed at him and unwavering, and Tristan bit the inside of his cheek when he realized he should have been keeping count from the moment he saw Soggy looking at his watch. He began late and made it to 34 seconds before the Milani closed his watch. Your hands, boy, the lieutenant said. Show them to us. Tristan did, not yet putting away the seal, and finally the tension lessened. Guns went down, several breathing out in relief. Congratulations, the watchwoman said. You are not being ridden by Amara. Ridden, Tristan said. As in being possessed? If you're lucky, the one called Soggy grimly replied. But you didn't burn under the Judas test, so your soul is clean. On which layer did you end up? Tristan choked. He could guess what the layer was, but the implication here surprised him. There's more than one? Soggy, the lieutenant sharply said. Shut your mouth. You, boy, Tristan a rascal, Tia, the thief provided. This time she let him finish, nodding. Tristan, she said. What did your surroundings look like? The orrery was dimmed, he said. And there were torches in the city. Second layer, she immediately said. Yours was just a shallow dive, you should be fine. Have yourself checked by a navigator anyway if you can, it pays to be prudent. A dive into what, Lieutenant? He pressed. She frowned, as if irked he would ask, but did not deny he had a right to. Tolman Terrace sits atop one of the largest ether wells in Vesper, she finally said. All that loose ether, it means that if enough taint is put out in a short amount of time it'll make an impression into the local fabric, a layer. You wandered into the one we call the witching hour. Tristan remembered what Tredegar had told him of Brun's confession, of how his little god had loved nothing more than the burst of flavor in the ether when men died. And so he knew where the taint for this witching hour had come from. It's from the night the watch took this island, he said. He got a sharp look for that. Clever kid, the lieutenant said, though it did not sound like a compliment. You avoided a bad end this time, Tristan O'Prascal, but I wouldn't count on a repeat if you wander back in. She leaned closer. If the Mara in there don't take you, a stray bullet will. He stilled at that revelation and she smiled nastily. Did you think you couldn't die in there? Ether's just as real as you are, boy, a shot of it in the head will kill you proper dead. She gestured for Soggy to come, ordering him to check the plaque and mark the number so his patron could be informed he had been out of bounds, though she seemed to believe him when he told her it was entirely unwilling. Welcome to Sholomance, Tristan O'Prascal, the watchwoman said afterwards, patting his shoulder. Best be more careful about where you step, if you want to last through the year. Tope continued. Thanks for listening.